We're excited to have Andrew Ujefsa, who's here from Ed Week, who has been a reporter covering this for multiple years, to moderate our panel. We're excited to have Kariga Rausch, who is the Vice President of Policy and Evaluation for the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. We have Hannah Scandera, who is with us, who has been not only the Chief State School Officer in New Mexico for the last 6 years, but has done a lot of work on school choice nationally across the board in many different areas. And finally, we have Michael Petrilli, who's with us. I like to say that Michael is one of our 4 distinguished senior fellows for the Education Commission of the States, but he also has a real job where he's president of the Fordham Institute. So please join me in welcoming our first panel discussion to the stage. Take it away, Andrew.
Thank you, Jeremy, for the very kind introduction. We really do have a all-star panel here today. And just a quick social media note, if you want to tweet about what you're hearing from our panelists, you can use the hashtag ECSNF17. And don't feel shy about doing it because
Mike's already started.
That's
Mike
right.
has
I'll be
already
doing it
started
throughout.
tweeting. He loves to tweet during panels, which we'll just leave it at that.
Jeremy is wrong about me having a real job. This is my real job. I tweet for a living, basically. It's a great gig. If you can get it.
So I just want to start off quickly with a poll that came out last month about school choice that I think might be a good starting point. And it was sponsored in part by the Associated Press. 58% of respondents said they heard little or nothing about charter schools. And an even higher percentage said, 66%, that they heard little or nothing about vouchers where they were. And in terms of what they thought of those policies, there were 47% of respondents who said they would like for there to be more charter schools, and 43% said that they would like to see more voucher programs. So I think those are interesting statistics, and they can kind of cut both ways depending on where you are, particularly in your state. I spend a lot of time in Washington covering and writing about Betsy DeVos. We can get to her and the education department in a little bit, but you know, I just wanted to start out with the most general question possible, which is, you know, given what's happening in Washington and around the states and what you're hearing from folks in states, where do you think the landscape is for school choice? You know, how much have things changed even over the last year or two? How much movement are you seeing? And Kariga, why don't we start with you, and we'll just go down the line and we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. And thank you to Jeremy and many others. This is just a fantastic venue. And it's fantastic to be here with a lot of faces that I've seen before and also quite a few new faces. So it's an honor to be here. Thank you, Jeremy, ECS, and others for what's going to be a terrific next 3 days. I don't think there's any question that school choice, not only in the news, but on the move in a lot of places. With all of the kind of different activities happening in State House that we're going to delve into a bit deeper, it's definitely a good time to be thinking about how we can make sure that more students and communities and families have access to high-quality schools. What I would say where we need to be concurrent to this conversation around expanding quality options is thinking really deeply about how we can increase the proportion of high-quality schools that students and families have access to. You see, choice by itself, if it's just providing more access to what exists, will not get us to better outcomes and achievement at scale. And it's been really interesting being in a lot of state houses and talking to a lot of folks, especially in the charter school space, really thinking deeply about ways in which we can engage in thinking about quality supply as a part of a choice agenda. So I look forward to saying some more and thinking some more about that with folks.
Do you agree, Mike?
I do. First of all, I think it's important for us to acknowledge somebody who's not here today but is on a lot of our minds, and that's Mitchell Chester. Just awful news this week about Mitchell passing. I know many of you knew him better than I did, but what I knew of him was that he was an incredibly thoughtful man, education leader, put kids first all the time. On this issue, it was one of these issues where I remember having a lot of debates with him. We didn't always agree on all of the nuances, but he was so sincerely interested in hearing feedback, even criticism, and I know many of us will be missing him and thinking about him. Okay, on the school choice front, yeah, I think Kariga's right, but I think we should always remember in these conversations, any policy, but certainly school choice, is that it's really a matter of trade-offs. And as policymakers, you've got to decide what it is that you're trying to achieve. Kariga talked about one value he put forward, which was that, hey, we should be using school choice to get better results. That's something I agree with. I think that is a big part of the point. But there's other values as well. One value is simply the value of giving parents power and more choices, right? It's the notion that, hey, in our society today with these big inequities that we've got, if you're upper middle class, if you're rich, you get to choose where your kid goes to school. You buy a house near a traditional public school that you want them to attend. Or you buy into the private school market. That's not going away. And the question is whether poor and working class families should get to have those choices too. I don't think any of us think that we're going to put the school choice genie back in the bottle and go back to a time when most kids attended the school that their local school district assigned to them because it was the one closest to them. And if they didn't like it, tough, right? That is not something we're going to go back to. In all of your states now, we have this wide range of choices, at least within the traditional public school system, but in most places also including charter schools, also including magnet schools, and increasingly including private schools. And so the debate is not whether we're going to have choice or not, but how wide the range of choices should be, and what the regulations and the rules are going to be for this variety of choice. And look, I think that I do hope that quality and outcomes is a big part of the conversation. I mean, in my opinion, if we have greater choice and more parental satisfaction, but we don't move those NAEP scores, and we're still lackluster in PISA scores, and we still aren't doing a good job helping poor kids climb the ladder of upward mobility, and we're not getting more kids prepared for college, and we're not, growing the number of kids contributing to our economy. If we don't make that progress, then we haven't done everything we could.
We're especially lucky to have Hannah here because she just wrapped up her tenure as Secretary of Education. So now she can say all the things that she didn't say to reporters like me for several years. So
I can really put you in your place now. All right, great.
Or that.
Great,
so
great. So I think you asked Andrew. I don't think folks answered your question actually. I think you asked, has there been more choice, more conversation around choice in the last year? And I would say absolutely. And I think it's been a really valuable conversation because sitting on this panel, we've already brought up values. What do we value most? Or what are the values in the spectrum of choice? And what kinds of choice are we talking about? Are we talking private, public, or many derivatives on the theme? And I would just say this is a well-timed conversation in our nation, an important one as we talk about where education has been, where it's going, and the spectrum. And I think it's a powerful opportunity to really get clear, or at least put on the table what are those things we value and what are we going to prioritize.
So I think in part because we're all thinking about and talking a lot about the Every Student Succeeds Act, the issue of school choice accountability is coming up more and more, I think, both inside and outside of the Beltway. So, there are a couple issues I think about when I think about school choice accountability that I think are giving school choice advocates headaches, problems, challenges, whatever you want to call it. There's the issue of, there are some Democratic lawmakers, like one I talked to, who said, look, the parent may think that he or she has school choice, but really the private school has the choice in terms of who they admit, right? So that's an issue that I think causes tension in the community. And then so how should we judge private schools with respect to things like test scores? Is it too much of a straitjacket to say that, well, they should take a similar test or as close a test as possible to what the public schools take? I know people like Hannah have been wrestling with that for years, So I just wonder where in terms of those accountability sort of pressure points, the ones that are causing the most problems for folks, and maybe a state where you think, if not a solution, is sort of on the right track maybe to answering it. And any one of you can take that.
I'll start by first acknowledging that New Mexico is ranked first in the nation for its ESSA plan recently, so just wanted to acknowledge for all the New Mexicans out there and for our great state. It's a proud moment. And while it did not wholesale talk about choice, we certainly talked about choice in the scope of our plan as well. I think as we look at ESSA and the opportunities it provides, and states, I know Louisiana has certainly branched out, if you will, into a broad bouquet of choice, and certainly wrestled with Where's the accountability piece? Where do we hold private schools to the exact same standards as our public schools, or is there a nuance on that theme? I personally believe that we do need accountability, but I do think it should look different than our traditional public schools when it comes to private school choice and opportunity. But we do need some ability for parents to have good information to make good choices for their students, even if it is on the private side as well, if we're talking vouchers.
Yeah, I think we should start by acknowledging, again, that this is about values, it's about trade-offs, and it happens in all sectors in American education. So we've all been through the debates around testing, and we would all acknowledge that reading and math tests do not encompass everything that we care about in our schools. And ESSA is an opportunity for states to try to broaden that, and we are seeing that. This review that Hannah referenced, where New Mexico did quite well, by Bellwether and the Collaborative for Student Success, this is the first 17 plans that have come in. They do find that states are really working hard at broadening the measures of success in our schools, but still, it's largely about tests. And the reason is the other measures, by and large, aren't ready for prime time. If you need to have a measure that's statewide and valid and reliable, and you can disaggregate by subgroup, there's a ton of other things to look at. There's some other things, and you're starting to include those, and that makes sense. But even then, it's going to be largely about test scores, and that rubs up against some models that may not be all that focused on tests. In the charter school sector, we've had this debate forever. We came out with a study at the Fordham Institute a few weeks ago looking at charter school applications and whether there was anything in them that would predict how the schools actually perform. Well, lo and behold, one of the things that was predictive was that if somebody proposed a student-centered model like Waldorf or Montessori or Paideia, those schools tended to struggle academically on test scores in the first few years. Important for authorizers to know, but as we said, that doesn't mean you should never allow those schools to open. Those schools are very popular with a lot of parents, and they may be doing a lot of great things for kids that don't show up on reading and math tests, but may show up in long-term outcomes. And so we struggle with this everywhere. In the private school sector, same thing, right? That there are schools, and in the voucher programs and tax credit programs, we're talking mostly about religious schools, which is a whole other issue, right? But religious schools that parents desperately want their kids to be in and that have some evidence that they are getting important outcomes, again, beyond the test scores, but long-term outcomes that we would care about. And so it's something that we struggle with. And I think the ESSA framework says, look, we're going to have this basic framework still of rating schools. It's going to be largely based on tests and a few other things. But then we have to figure out ways to deal with that without making it a straitjacket, so that there's still some room for variety, some room for parental choice, some room for innovation in all of the sectors in education.
So, Kari, I know that recently the news has not been so good for things when you look at online charter schools. That's taken some hits in the media from publications like ours and others. And there was a recent study that came out saying that for-profit operators of charter schools tended to have lower results than the nonprofit operators. So have things like that contributed to you sort of having a more sort of restrictive view of accountability, or the reverse, or how have those kind of recent developments influenced your thinking?
Yeah, no, terrific question, and one that I'm glad you brought up. And we're talking about both testing, online learning, and accountability, critical topics that I know a lot of folks in states are dealing with right now. I would say that first, as it pertains to testing, I totally agree with what Hannah and Mike have indicated around some of the struggles and tensions that exist around that. I think some of the good news is that testing and the technologies around testing is getting better in a lot of places. There are some new things, new ways in which we are assessing students and the ways in which they're learning and the ways in which they are achieving that I think are really helpful. Andrew, you also asked about, are there, any states out there that we think have kind of gotten this accountability and kind of outcomes with flexibility kind of bargain right. I think everybody would say that every state has a lot to do on that. I would say that my home state of Indiana has done a particularly good job of being pretty tight on outcomes and loose on process and inputs. pretty demanding in what the outcome expectations are, while allowing folks the freedom and innovation and flexibility of how to get there. In my home state of Indiana, there is a blanket waiver on all rules and regulations that apply to traditional district schools for the charter sector, with then just a handful of those rewritten back in that apply. That kind of framework allows for charters to have the kind of flexibility necessary to innovate. And in our voucher law, which I think is also really strong on accountability, it does have expectations of student outcomes, very little in terms of kind of inputs and process. I think that kind of tight on outcomes and loose on how we're getting there makes a lot of sense. At the same time, it would be remiss if we didn't say that, to Mike's good point around lots of different values here, how students are doing and how they ultimately end up matters a lot. And you brought up the idea of virtual education. I want to say very clearly that what we've learned in a lot of states and a lot of places around the country, virtual education can be a game changer for a lot of students for whom it benefits from. There is a lot of evidence, not just test score based, but also based on a lot of other indicators, that for the masses of students that are attending full-time online schools, I say that very specifically to differentiate from online learning. Those are two different concepts, and we can talk about that a little bit more later. But students who are attending full-time online schools, the outcomes are pretty demoralizing in most places. And we have to rethink our organization along with others to put out some different policy ideas around how to resituate full-time virtual online schools that to make sure that the right students can benefit from that, because what we're seeing now isn't, I think, what any of us would hope to see with full-time virtual online schools.
And it seems like such a pressing issue, because I think when a lot of people think about where charter schools operate for the most part, and where vouchers operate in many states, not all states, but in many states, online learning seemed like the next sort of frontier to push that. And then, we get this research, and it does. I know that Betsy DeVos has brought it up as a potential avenue, but to what extent are you worried that the charter and or the voucher sectors become sort of balkanized in certain places, in certain metro areas, and even to a certain extent in certain states? Is that a concern at this point?
Well, first on the online front, I think it's fair to say a lot of people in the charter school movement would love to kick the online charters out. It's a weird fit. Charter schools, keep in mind, are supposed to be open enrollment, meaning open to everybody. And if there's more kids that want into the school than you've got to have a lottery. It can't be selective like even a magnet school in traditional public schools can be, or like a private school can be. And what we're finding on online schools, not surprisingly, is that it works really well for some kids and really badly for others. You've got to have a kid who's, pretty driven, and they need to have a home environment where they're getting a lot of support. And so what you might want to make virtual schooling work is to be able to be selective, frankly, is to be able for those schools to figure out if a student is a good candidate to be successful in that mode. And that is not allowed under the charter model. So I think having it instead be something that maybe is a state-run program where the state runs it directly, or there's some role for the traditional, high school or other traditional schools would make more sense. Even going back to the original model in Florida with the Florida virtual school might work better than having these be these other statewide models. I do hope we get back to this question you had before, Andrew, about states that are doing this well and doing it well either for charter schools or doing it well for vouchers. And I think there are some we can talk about. Not just New Mexico, Hannah, but certainly including New Mexico.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about New Mexico. I would say, I think one of the things I thought you were going towards, Andrew, was just what about our rural communities? And in New Mexico, that's the majority of our state. And I think that there are incredible pathways forward when it comes to online learning and the opportunities it can provide. I think we've just scratched the surface. And I think it's incumbent upon us, particularly if we're in states that are rural, to begin to really push that envelope, because we talk about equal access and opportunity. But I'll speak from my own state. We push for that every single day, but we certainly do not have it based on sheer location, whatever it may be. And I think there are opportunities looming that we need to push and press. Unfortunately, in New Mexico, I think our Senate, the chair of our Senate Ed, Senator Souls, is here. We've had some tight budget times, and we zeroed out our online learning avenue to date. But the opportunity rests in saying, okay, so how do we rethink this in a way that makes sense for kids? Because just because you live in an area that doesn't have all the bells and whistles of a urban setting doesn't mean you shouldn't have the great opportunity to learn.
So you mentioned Indiana, Kariga, and I think there's been a lot of research coming out about vouchers and their impact on student performance over several years. And what struck me, I think that a lot of the news reports, characterize them generally as negative. I think there are probably some positive for school choice advocates to take away. But what struck me was that in 2, if not 3 cases, in the first year of the voucher program, the student performance really took a big hit. It really declined. And then, as it started to recover, either, not quite at the pace of learning growth as students in public schools or a comparable rate. And I want that sort of initial plunge, maybe it's not entirely surprising, but it's also something that I feel like needs to be addressed, because I think that says a lot about, the actual students that you're dealing with, that they're human beings, they're not widgets. They go through transitions like everybody else does. It's difficult at first. But at the same time, learning loss is learning loss. And if you're starting sort of from behind the 8 ball and you have to catch up, that's not how you want to sell school choice, right? So what does that sort of initial plunge that we've seen in 2 or 3 studies, what does that say to you? Is there any way to address that, or is it just the facts of life? Any one of you?
Yeah. Well, this finding goes back a long way. I mean, it's pretty consistent, and it's for school choice, but it's also for any kind of mobility. Right? Whenever a kid changes schools, and of course it happens a lot within traditional public schools, especially high poverty districts, kids are moving around all the time because their families are moving or whatever. You see the same problem, is that it's definitely disruptive. And the question is, how long does it take until they get back up? And we are seeing that curve. I think in the charter setting, and we got to keep being careful. We're talking about vouchers, we're talking about charters. Yes. In the charter setting, you don't see as much of this dip, and in part because I think the brand new charters, can design for this. They can prepare for this. They can say, okay, we know that we're going to have kids coming into a new school. How do we help them hit the ground running? And the better charters now, you don't see the same amount of loss. In the voucher setting, in the first year of a school voucher program, what you've got are these existing private schools that are used to serving a certain clientele, and now they're taking in a new group of kids who are often lower performing, oftentimes lower income, and it's a new challenge. And some of them aren't very good at it, or at least aren't very good at it at first. And over time they adjust, or maybe they decide this isn't something that they actually want to be in the business of doing. And so I think we should expect that. On the state front, I do want to put out there some states that are doing this well, or some places. All right, on the charter side, you look at these, where is the school choice nirvana? I would say Washington, D.C. is a place that continues to be a leader. You've got about half the kids in charter schools. You have a charter school sector that is high performing and getting better. And you have a traditional public school system that is making huge strides. And I think those two things are related. That's probably our best place to argue that that competition can work to lift all boats. It helps with the politics to make some reforms possible, and we're seeing much better results. Denver is another big one with the policies in Colorado. Here again, you've got a school system that's improving. That actually is the sponsor of the charter schools, and you've got achievement looking much more positive. Indianapolis is another one with supportive policies on the charter front as well. I think Tennessee is interesting, is making some progress. So there are places to look at, and in my view, states are doing 2 things right when they are creating these environments. First of all, they're getting the oversight right, which means in the charter setting, authorizing. They are figuring out who should be the entity to authorize charter schools, and they are empowered to do that job well. And second is funding. And here I am as a conservative. I will say it. You can tweet it. Yes, money matters, right? That you cannot do school choice on the cheap and expect to get good results. And unfortunately, we have tried that in too many places, and certainly in Ohio, where we do a lot of work, that has been the story. When you look at those high-quality places where charters are working, you see very healthy funding, if not equal funding with the traditional public schools. That's why probably the most significant thing that I think happened in school choice this year, it wasn't about Betsy DeVos. It was about Colorado and Florida, where the state legislatures enacted laws that said that charter schools have a right to access the local property taxes where they are located. And this is a huge boon for equity, for those kids. It didn't make any sense before to have low-income kids who were going to public schools, but we were spending much less on their education, even though they were living in these communities that were generating the taxes. So that is something I hope all of you work on in your states as well.
And I think in Colorado, which I'm more familiar with, it was a clean split, right, in terms between the district and charter. Kariga, can you talk about that a little bit? Is that sort of the next step, and does it also improve sort of local buy-in for charter schools, local money, local buy-in? Does that make sense to you?
Well, there's a fundamental equity question, right, associated with this, that are charter parents who are local and state taxpayers entitled to resources for their kids? I think the answer to that is yes. And so I think it is a good sign for places like Colorado and Florida, where we are looking at more equity in financial resources. I do think that matters. I do think it's important. The only things I also wanted to respond to that Mike indicated is that in the places that he kind of ticked off that are doing some pretty interesting and important work, those in other places, and one thing they also all have in common is they have really strong and robust school supply infrastructures, right, where they have organizations, they have people that are really thinking deeply about human capital needs in who's going to start new schools, who's going to lead new schools, and a fairly exacting process for making sure that quality folks are engaging in this work. What we're finding in different places across the country is that matters a lot in those places. You need to have the other infrastructure pieces in place, but and largely we have relegated school supply work to the philanthropic community, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I do think there is a role for state houses and other places to play as it pertains to funding and supporting robust human capital and especially school leadership infrastructure kind of development programs. Because as we're seeing nationwide changes in the number of new charters, the number of new folks applying for charters in different kind of places across the country, what has become really consistent in a lot of places has been if you have a robust infrastructure for developing people to lead new schools, you tend to not only have more folks engage in this work, but better outcomes for kids and families.
I wanted to touch briefly on school choice and special education. And we're sort of approaching Betsy DeVos sort of crab fashion here, kind of backwards. But it has gotten a lot more attention recently. And you know, I would, again, you know, come back to Mike's point about like which states are doing it right, so to speak. But I wonder if any state has figured that out, and also if it's just become more controversial, if it's become more difficult for states to deal with, given the limited dollars that are often available and the extra costs associated with special education in many cases. I know that's a tricky one, but Hannah, I can sense you want to take it. So.
I got the hand up. I actually don't feel well equipped to dive in. I'm going to quick hand off to Kariga on this because I think he's looked at more around this issue. Obviously, when I worked in Florida, we did have a robust opportunity to serve students with special needs, and I think it was an important piece and choice for students. And I think we, once again, I'll just answer generally and say, wherever we can push to have high quality choices and options for kids who, particularly when they have special needs, literally and figuratively, I think we need to keep pushing that envelope. And I think the conversations we're having today help us close those gaps. On specifics, though, I would defer to Kariga or Mike, if you have.
Either one of you, take it away.
Yeah, you know, I think here the research is pretty clear that charters don't quite serve as many special ed kids as traditional public schools. You know, in most categories, it looks like the concerns about creaming or, you know, have been misplaced, that the charter kids are, you know, perform about the same as traditional public school kids as they come into the system. You know, pretty similar in terms of race and class and other things to neighborhood schools, and a little bit differences state by state, but pretty consistent findings that not serving quite as many special ed kids. There's always been this question about whether some of that is because some of the charters, they just philosophically believe in trying not to put that special ed label on kids who might be, you know, maybe kids with learning disabilities that, you know, maybe you could give them that label or an IEP, maybe not. But there's also some evidence that maybe it's for real. And I think, look, this is one of these areas where the charter movement continues to work on making sure that schools are open to these kids. And then we also have to acknowledge that, in any big traditional public school system, no one given school is serving all types of kids, including all types of disabilities. They specialize. They have the autism program over here, and they have the other program over here. You couldn't possibly afford to serve every single type of disability under the same roof. And so we've got to think about in the charter sector, if you've got a city, for example, that's got lots of charters, I think it's on the charter movement to make sure that there is at least one school within that movement that will serve any type of disability. Doesn't necessarily mean that every single school has to be equipped to do that, because that would be cost prohibitive to make that happen. But as we get to more scale, these are the kind of issues you got to work out. And this is happening in DC, it's happening in New Orleans, where you have some of these issues getting hammered out to say, let's make sure that there is a place, a high quality place for everyone. Same thing when you talk about expulsions, for example. If we're going to have most of the system be charter schools, then you got to start thinking about how you deal with expulsions. You can't let charters just kick kids out of their schools willy-nilly. So, these are the kinds of things that you have to deal with as these charters become more and more the main system, the main option.
Is there a district or a state that you think is at least on the right track, Corriga, on this very tricky issue?
Yeah, I would look at Denver. Is one that comes to mind initially, and some of the interesting things and ways that they are trying to provide incentives for both district-run schools and charter schools to effectively educate kids with disabilities, including those with severe and profound disabilities. And I think that's particularly important. This is particularly very personal for me. Prior to my work at NACSA, I spent a lot of time working with school districts and states that had too many kids of color in special education and in school disciplinary systems. And it's very difficult to talk about special education without talking about overrepresentation. I think what special education suffers from a long legacy that was good and well-intentioned, but there is a regulatory burden around that is, I think, stifling new and different innovative ways of figuring out ways of not just serving kids with disabilities, but helping them to achieve at much higher levels than they are now. And if there is one space for there to be some, I think, really active thinking amongst folks like you and others, is what are the right incentives what incentives can we put in place that can truly incentivize the kind of innovative thinking around how to truly drive results for kids with disabilities, and in particular, kids with disabilities that look like me.
Let's talk about Betsy DeVos. The whole situation with DeVos in DC sort of reminds me of that line from Good Morning Vietnam: if you're going to fight, clash. And she has really, I think, driven lots of people into lots of different respective camps, maybe even polarized people. For some folks, that might be sort of clarifying as to where people stand that they thought maybe were on their side or sort of on their side. How helpful has her tenure been so far, do you guys think, in terms of crystallizing school choice debates and helping folks figure out sort of where they stand, not just people they work with? Has she been helpful to the debates around school choice?
No.
That's it?
I disagree.
All right. Oh, good. We're
Oh,
fine.
good.
Right.
Disagreement.
There we go.
Too little
you make your
disagreement on
case
this
first.
panel. Good. Okay.
So I think if you look at anybody who is passionate and courageous and working to drive change, and you look at, and maybe this comes out of my own experience in New Mexico in my first year. Usually your first year, if you're really pushing, is gonna bring up a whole lot of stuff. And you don't sort it out in your first year. If you do, then it should have been done a long time ago, because it didn't, obviously didn't take that long. And I think she's bringing to the surface a lot of values conversations that need to be had, a lot of opportunities, if we seize them, to look at choice and ask tough questions and really get to the bottom line that maybe we were avoiding before, or just we're not having the conversation. So I think it's way too early to give it a short answer like that, Mike, and without giving the opportunity to play this out and push ourselves. If we really believe as states and that our responsibility in our states around education, then it's incumbent upon us to begin to push that needle on the conversation of what matters, what are the right parameters, what are our values on these issues. And I think it's a little early I appreciated the dramatic, but the flair for the dramatic that Mike has. But I would also push a little bit on the seeming lack of, there's a lot of nuance in this.
Yeah. All well said. And look, I think, first of all, I supported Betsy DeVos when she was up for nomination. I signed a letter. I like her. I think in the last few weeks, she and her team are starting to, things are going a little bit smoother. I mean, they are in a tough spot, partly because they're, still don't have the staff they need, and I think most of that's not in their control. And look, anybody in this position of serving as President Trump's education secretary is going to have a tough time. I mean, this is a president that, as you know, is historically low approval ratings, and approval ratings in the education community, whether you consider yourself in the sort of traditional education community or education reformers, is, abysmal. Okay, so she has a tough job, and I think that's a huge part of what's going on. My main concern is that by federalizing the school choice conversation, that we may be, in fact, damaging it. And, we haven't talked yet about the proposals that they've made. Personally, I don't think they're going to end up going anywhere, but already, just by putting some ideas out there that maybe there's going to be this new federal role in school choice, I think it has brought a lot of negative attention to the debate. You've seen a lot of negative press stories already. The press is going to do what it does, no offense, Andrew, which is, it sees its role as being oppositional. It plays differently at the national level than at the state level. And so there's been one slew of negative articles about school choice after another. Is that helpful? I don't think that's, if you care about school choice and think it's a promising strategy, not necessarily. And I think that now this debate about are we going to have Washington step in and have some big new choice initiative, I worry that it's creating headwinds at the state level. I didn't see on the private school side a whole lot of progress in the states this spring. Now, I'm not going to blame that on Betsy DeVos, but I think that the DeVos-Trump thing created some headwinds for school choice advocates that we could have done without.
So, Kariga, as you're probably aware, there was a recent op-ed published by Randy Weingarten and Jonah Edelman, two people who normally don't get along in many respects on education, but they both said no to vouchers. Vouchers are bad. And I've been thinking a lot about the charter school community where Mike mentioned the proposals. One of them is to boost charter school grants by 50% up to about $500 million. Not an insignificant sum, not huge. But I've seen a few charter school folks saying, look, that money is not worth it for everything else that you want to do, for the other line items that Trump wants to cut that serve charter schools and not just the traditional public schools. So how much of a vice do you feel like you're being put in here?
So I think there is a different conversation happening amongst the kind of national talking class and those that are happening in individual states. They said it, I didn't.
I'm just a reporter.
I'm in the talking class. I'm dramatic. I'm even talking about my socks.
Not saying that you do have a great sock game going, though.
Thank you. And the three-piece suit at the beach is incredible. Yeah.
Anyway.
Don't know how to segue out of that one, but in a lot of the places that we're working with, advocacy coalitions are built on relationships, and they're built on relationships in states. I was fortunate enough to be a part of one for a number of years in Indiana, and have observed this in other places that I think if there are fractures of those kind of choice coalitions, whether it's choice, voucher, and charter, and other kinds of places, it's because those relationships weren't strong to begin with. I think when you do see those relationships in states that have been strong for a number of years, there's much less fracturing kind of happening, and I think there is a big difference with national organizations, the things that they're talking about, but then when you get into local states, I'm not seeing as much fracturing as one would allow it to believe. I don't know if you're seeing that as well, Hannah, but that's kind of been our observation.
I would agree. I think the conversation at the national talking piece that's taking place, which is important, and certainly that's where often we start all these values conversations, et cetera. But I think when I think about the conversation that's taking place, we're going to go home, we're going to get done what we think is right by our kids. And so and the relationship piece, I completely agree, Krieg. If those relationships are there, this is an opportunity to get clear about values and what's most important, what we haven't been doing well for kids, what we could do better versus a divide that I see at the local level. I don't see it.
Mike mentioned that he doesn't think her proposals or the budget proposals for school choice that the Trump administration has put out are going to go anywhere. That includes a new private school choice program, i.e. Federally funded vouchers, and a $1 billion public school choice program, which I think a lot of people are saying, I don't know how that's going to work, but okay. So do you guys agree that you think that those proposals are probably conversation starters, but kind of dead in the water? Feel free to disagree with Mike, please.
Go for it, guys.
I mean, look, most presidents' budgets are dead in the water. Right? I mean, that's just the way the process works. Even President Obama, President George W. Bush, I mean, they put forward budgets, and most of the time Congress ignores them. That's kind of how the process works. So in the best of circumstances, and these are controversial proposals. The Congress hates most of the budget because of the big cuts.
Yep.
So I just wouldn't worry about those. The big thing to watch is whether or not the administration proposes a big voucher-like initiative as part of the tax reform bill. And I think that's the big one to watch, because if they do it, it could be a big $20 billion behemoth that could fund hundreds of thousands of kids all over the country to go to private schools. That would be a real game changer. That's the one to watch, not what's in the budget.
I am not optimistic of big things happening at the federal level. I am much more optimistic about really important things happening in states. And probably more optimistic that getting the balance of autonomy and accountability right, expanding quality options, really thoughtful people in states. I'm much more optimistic about the opportunities that exist. And I want to give a personal, thank you to people that were really helpful in my development from Indiana. Senator Cruz is here. I know I saw Representative Baining, and I'll always call you Senator Lovers, even though she now heads our Commission on Higher Education from Indiana. That's done just terrific work in this space.
Hannah, I mean, you've been through a lot of political battles over the years. Is this conversation at the federal level, do you think is just too tough to move anything forward?
I agree with Mike on this, that since when do we see a budget come out from a president that doesn't evolve immensely? So I'm sure we'll see a lot of evolution. I do agree that choice overall, to me, is a state issue, first and foremost. But I also believe that there are ways to incentivize at the federal level, whether through budget and or policy on any number of issues. We've seen that happen, and I think there'll be a good push, and I think something will happen, not necessarily through the budget we're talking about right now.
Okay. Well, I have more questions, but it's probably time to turn it over to you guys. If you have a question about any of these issues or other issues, just raise your hand. There are a couple, I think, of folks with mics running around. There's one over there, and the light's in my eye, so I can't see the other one, maybe over there. And if anyone wants to ask Hannah about what she's doing next, that would be great. Maybe
That's
she'll
what Andrew
say,
wants.
Maybe we'll make a little more news here. So just raise your hand if you have a question, which I'm sure folks do. I see a hand. There we go. And if you could identify yourself, and please keep it short, and please make it a question. Thank you.
Mark Elgard, Vance Ed. First, Mike loves socks. I absolutely love them.
Okay, we're off to a good start.
Good. Just a statement leading to the question. Standards and expectations for all schools, whether they're public, private, or charter, should be the same. And the rural school choice, it can't be just online learning. Any states or any policies that you think we should consider in expanding real choice in rural America?
So, on the first part, look, Louisiana and Indiana basically have what you're describing, which is that public, private, and charter, they're all in the state accountability system. And I personally think that's a great model. But, of course, there are these trade-offs. It does, maybe keep some innovation from happening. On the rural folks, I love that point. We always think, how does school choice, we go to the online thing. We did a study in Ohio just a few weeks ago that came out about inter-district enrollment. Ohio, like a lot of states, has had this policy for decades to allow kids to go to another school district. Well, guess what? The places where it's happening the most in Ohio are in small towns and rural areas. and upwards of tens of thousands of kids every year. It may be that the way the borders are drawn, that the closest school to them is not their own home district school, and so they go across the line, or the town over has a specialized program that they want to take advantage of. And I think that's a hugely promising way to, again, allow for some specialization in places that don't have a lot of population density. And it can be done competitively, but it also can be done in a coordinated way. I mean, certainly rural communities have always had CTE programs, regionally, because those are expensive and need some concentration. But you can do that with a whole variety of programming. And at least we see some evidence that families will get their kids to these different locations if it's compelling enough.
I would point you, some of the people that I'm becoming more and more convinced, I think to your point, that simply saying online learning, right, is a solution for rural education, right, is insufficient. And that we need to think, I think, differently about human capital development in our rural communities. And I think that there's some charter incubators, but are also kind of doing some human capital incubation work that will be interesting folks to have this conversation with. I'm thinking about folks like the Mind Trust in Indianapolis or New Schools for New Orleans that's operating in New Orleans. I'm also thinking about Moonshot Adventures in Denver that I know is starting to think about, right, this idea of how can we develop human capital. And I think that the conversation around rural education is becoming more and more on folks' in folks' vision, that I think it would be appropriate to have that conversation with folks that are really thinking deeply about human capital development in rural communities.
Okay. Hi, my name is Tate Aldrich. I'm the 2017 New Hampshire Teacher of the Year from New Hampshire. So we started this conversation. You said that the school choice genie can't be put back in the bottle. But there are a lot of people that I work with that I know who don't like that genie. So I'm wondering how all of you might convince someone for whom school choice offends their personal sensibilities, political sensibilities, personal sensibilities, cogently and hopefully with some empirical or anecdotal information.
Good question.
I'll do an anecdotal. I have had the privilege of being a big sister in the Big Brother, Big Sister program for 5 years. And my little sister is awesome. I might be slightly biased. And I had the privilege about 4 years ago of going to her parent-teacher conference. Her mom asked me to go with her. And we went, and she's amazing. She's doing awesome, 95s and 100s on everything. Top of her school in spelling, and she's not the top grade, just off the charts. I'm proud, she's proud, her mom's proud. And at the end, I was quiet, and for those of you who know me, that's rare. And I just said, is Adriana on grade level? And she wasn't, in reading or math. And we can talk about wanting more than just reading and math, but her mom wanted reading and math. I think it was fair for her to want that for her daughter. And so her mom got up after we were done and went to the principal, who's a wonderful woman, and said, can we get a tutor for my daughter? They had great tutoring programs there. No, she's too high performing. Her mom turned to me and said, I want her to be challenged and I want her to be ready for whatever school she goes to next. What can I do? And her mom learned to advocate for her, and Adriana's now at a charter school. She was at a chronically failing school, and it gave her an opportunity that she otherwise, based on zip code, would not have had. As I look ahead and think about what's offensive or just a values struggle around choice and opportunities. To me, the most offensive thing across our nation today is that some get and some don't. And how do we begin to close those gaps? And education is certainly one of them. And choice provides, it's not a panacea, it provides an opportunity. Today, Adriana's on grade level. And her siblings are also in a great school.
And can't follow up on what that is the truth, other than I was thinking about, as Hannah was sharing that story, I'm a dad. I've got a 9 and 11-year-old girls. And when I think about what is unifying for parents and educators, it's schools that bring out the God-given amazing stuff that's in them to do the kind of things that they need. What I'm getting ready to say may actually provide more ammunition for folks that are just fundamentally against choice. I agree with Hannah. Choice should be a fundamental right, but the greatest barrier, and I think the biggest threat to making sure more kids have high quality choices, is crappy choices for them to choose from. And to the degree that we are expanding opportunities for kids to go to more crappy schools, I'm not for that. But what I am for, and what I am for my own daughters, what I'm for a whole lot of other kids, and that I think unites most educators and most folks that are in this space, is we want more great schools that actually work for kids. Are there certainly value judgments associated with that? Are there differences? Especially when we're talking about how to fund different ways, of course. But I always try to start from a place of where we agree, and then thinking about how can we move from that place of agreement, which is for my daughters and for thousands and millions of other kids across the country. What is it going to take to make sure they get what they need to achieve their potential?
I'm not a parent, but I do Big Brothers Big Sisters also. It's a great program. I recommend that everybody do it. So is there another question there in the back?
Okay. Joe Garcia, Colorado, Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education. Like the panelists, I am also an advocate for choice, but as the panelists just noted, choice by itself isn't the answer. It has to be a series of good choices. In Colorado, we have some that are not very good, that in fact perform very, very poorly. And so I just want to know if you make a distinction between for-profit charter schools and those that are nonprofit charter schools.
So I'll start by saying two things. One, there are a lot of folks that make that distinction. I think that distinction is one that is not all that helpful or useful in the big conversations that we need to have. The better conversation is who's doing great by kids and who's not at the end of the day. And there's some emerging evidence that there are some differences by tax status. I would say that evidence is emerging. We still need to know more about it. But I think the conversation we need to have, and I know that thoughtful people in states are having, should be less about what's the tax status of the organization versus are kids learning at really high levels. And if they are, I could care less what their tax status is if kids are getting great results.
I 100% agree, and I would just say I've been incredibly popular in my state on many fronts, but on one, to highlight for a moment, we tried to move a bill to close charter schools who have made promises to parents and kids and didn't keep them. And what I mean by that is they're not performing well, and they're not serving these students well. And I fundamentally believe that it is important that we give students good choices and opportunities and steward, when we don't, our taxpayer dollars and ensure that we're investing in those things that really do make a difference when it comes to our students.
Can I piggyback on that really quickly, just leaving New Mexico again? Generally, do you guys think that states or authorizers have been too quick on the trigger to close struggling charter schools or too slow on the trigger to do that?
If you asked me that question 5 years ago, I would have said way too slow. Way too slow. I would say now it's gotten tremendously better. And if you actually look at the evidence around the proportion of schools that are, really failing in the kind of bottom 10% of their performance distribution, it's been cut in half the last 5 years. There's been a tremendous progress in authorizers and in some cases states incenting authorizers to close schools that are demonstrably failing kids. And while we shouldn't celebrate a school closing, I mean, that's a disruption for kids and for families. You have to do it really thoughtfully and really carefully. The truth is a failing school is a generational problem, right? And we know that. And so good authorizing does absolutely entail making sure that schools that are not doing well for kids don't have the opportunity to not only continue to serve those kids, but for generations of kids coming after them.
In this point, let's make sure we hear this. It's so easy in these rooms, we often are bemoaning the lack of progress, and for understandable reason, but there has been progress. In the traditional public schools, huge progress. better graduation rates, improved achievement. In the charter sector, huge progress in willingness to shut down charter schools. As a result, the more recent studies that are coming out of charter schools are showing increased achievement. So we are moving in the right direction. And I think we now have the states where nobody is shutting down those low-performing schools are becoming the outliers. You know, we were involved in a big cleanup effort in Ohio that is really having an impact. I think Ohio's charter sector in a few years from now is going to be much better than it is now. There have been similar efforts in Texas and Arizona. There has been a willingness to self-correct, and I think that that's why the charter movement is really heading in a very positive direction.
Well said.
We have time for one more quick question. In the back.
Hi, I'm Casey Bethel. I am the 2017 Georgia Teacher of the Year.
All right.
I know you said one, but I was going to ask two really, really quick questions.
Super quick then. Okay.
All right, here we go. I hear you say that we want to expand the high-performing choices for schools, for students to attend. And the way we do that is through school accountability. Yet I heard you say at the same time that private schools like Montessori and Paeta have, let me get the wording right, they do other things for students that don't show up directly in math and reading scores, which is what you said. Mm-hmm. Having taught 13 years, I can attest that that's been the statement that public schools have been trying to get out for years. It's gone unheard. How can you reconcile that? And then my second comment, which is a great concern for Georgia, is this. Because you mentioned private schools and vouchers, we are concerned that unless the voucher covers the complete cost of tuition, as well as outside needs like transportation, vouchers won't help the students in the lowest socioeconomic bands who need the most help anyway.
Yep.
Two very good questions.
I'll take a first crack. First, on the second question, look, my own view is in a world of limited resources, if we're going to have voucher programs, we should target them to low-income kids. That is certainly the way that it is in most places in the voucher side. There's been some states that have started to include middle class or working class families, but I think targeted programs make sense. And yes, we got to fund them so that you can actually attend a good private school. And yes, I am admitting that there is a tension here between accountability based on test scores and all these other things that we as educators care about, that we as parents care about, that we as the public cares about, and that we've got to keep trying to wrestle with that. Now, we don't want to go to one extreme or the other, right? We had a problem in the No Child Left Behind era in places like Georgia where, there was all this pressure and teachers cheated or there was a test prep factory. We don't want that, right? But we also don't want to go to the other extreme where we turn a blind eye if there's kids who aren't learning to read and do math and learn to write. Especially we're talking about poor kids whose only shot at making it out of poverty is going to be by building really strong knowledge and skills so that they can succeed in a high-quality career prep program and go to a 4-year program and graduate, or a high-quality CTE program and get a real credential or get a 2-year degree and go on to the middle class. That is the pathway. And so we have got to have a huge sense of urgency, in my view, especially pre-K to 8, to get that job done, right? And if we're not, then, we have a real problem. So we got to balance both of those things, and that's the challenge. That's your challenge as policymakers, is to have accountability but also have room for innovation, to pay attention to the test scores but don't go too far.
So Mike and his socks get the last word. So I want to thank you guys, and please give them a round of applause.
As you can all see, these are not simple issues or a simple discussion. And we're really thankful for the panel for delving into this, and we're going to have multiple breakout sessions right after this that are going to delve even further.